My sister forged our father's will and kept 98% of the inheritance, while I inherited $52,000 in debts. I spent 5 years paying everything off. After settling the debt, I hired a specialist attorney in forgery. We proved the fraud, and the judge reversed the decision. She had to pay me $380,000. My real name is Deborah Christina Almeida. I'm 42 years old with an existence deeply marked by devastating family betrayals that I imagined impossible to happen outside melodramatic soap operas. And for 5 entire, exhausting, endless years, I carried alone the crushing weight of $52,000 in fraudulently inherited debts, while my older sister, Patricia, lived ostentatiously, luxuriously, in a mansion bought with money from the estate that should have been divided equally, fairly between us two, according to the wishes repeatedly expressed verbally by our father Mauricio during the years preceding his sudden death. I'm a self-employed accountant working mainly with small family businesses, desperately trying to keep organized, accounting amid recurring economic crises, providing tax consulting to honest merchants trying to survive with dignity in the relentless American economy, spending endless hours bent over complex spreadsheets and intricate tax returns in a tiny office, rented in a modest commercial building where every penny saved meant the possibility of paying off one more installment of the unjust debts inherited through criminal document manipulation that I discovered too late, too painfully to avoid years of anguishing financial suffering. The devastating, revolting, ultimately redemptive story I'm going to narrate now, with every painful detail permanently etched in traumatized memory, began on a gray, heavy June morning when I received a phone call at 5:43 in the morning. That type of call every child fears eventually receiving, but is never truly emotionally prepared to face when it finally happens. It was my sister Patricia, voice strangely controlled. Too cold considering the gravity of the words she pronounced mechanically without showing any apparent genuine emotion, while I still fought against heavy sleep after sleeping only 4 hours because I had worked until almost 2 in the morning finishing urgent tax returns for 3 clients simultaneously, with deadlines expiring relentlessly. Deborah, Dad suffered a stroke during the night. His nurse called me 20 minutes ago informing that he was found unconscious in the bathroom around 4 in the morning. The paramedics already took him to the hospital. But according to preliminary information, the situation is extremely serious, critical, probably neurologically irreversible. She reported with that professional, distant voice, as if describing a technical problem with defective equipment instead of announcing imminent family tragedy involving our only remaining father after our mother died prematurely from cancer 8 years ago. I dressed frantically, hurriedly, in the first outfit I found thrown over the chair in the tiny bedroom of my modest rented apartment, hands trembling uncontrollably, making it difficult to button a simple shirt and put on shoes worn by excessive daily use. Driving dangerously fast through streets still dark and deserted in the early morning to the large public hospital located in the urban periphery where my father had been admitted as an emergency. Patricia was already waiting in the ICU reception when I arrived, breathless, desperate. She impeccably dressed in an expensive, elegant outfit despite the absurd hour, as if she had prepared meticulously for an important business meeting instead of a family medical emergency. Makeup perfectly applied without a visible flaw, platinum blonde hair falling impeccably over shoulders covered by a recognizable designer blazer. We contrasted brutally, me the disheveled, sweaty, dressed hastily in wrinkled, cheap clothes, her polished, controlled, emanating that aura of material superiority that always made me feel small, inadequate, financially failed in constant implicit comparisons during tense family gatherings over decades. The doctor said he won't survive. Deborah, the brain hemorrhage was too extensive, irreparably destroyed critical areas. They're keeping him alive artificially through machines, but there's no significant measurable brain activity. It's just a matter of hours, or at most days, until we officially declare death. Patricia informed clinically, coldly, while examining perfectly manicured nails in a vibrant dark red tone, as if discussing an unfavorable weather forecast instead of the imminent death of our father who raised us alone dedicatedly after our mother's premature death. I felt something strange, disturbing in that excessive coldness of hers, that absolute lack of visible, genuine emotion, but initially attributed it to traumatic shock manifesting differently in different people. Some crying copiously while others freeze emotionally as a psychological defense mechanism against unbearable, overwhelming pain. In the following nebulous, confused days that mixed in an incomprehensible blur of endless hospital visits, whispered conversations with tired doctors, impossible decisions about withdrawing artificial life support, my father Mauricio died silently, peacefully at 3:17 in the afternoon on a rainy Thursday, without regaining consciousness even once, without being able to say final goodbyes or communicate important last wishes. The funeral was a small, modest ceremony with only 15 people present at the wake held in a simple chapel of the municipal cemetery. Some retired colleagues from the old industry where Dad had worked loyally for 45 consecutive years, 3 elderly neighbors from the building where he lived alone since refusing to move to either daughter's house, valuing personal independence while health allowed, local priest who barely knew her father but conducted a generic standardized funeral rite pronouncing comforting religious platitudes about eternal life and deserved heavenly peace. Patricia cried dramatically, visibly, during the entire ceremony, tears flowing abundantly down her made-up face, smearing expensive mascara in theatrical dark stains, accepting consoling embraces from those present, while sobbing loud enough to draw everyone's attention, performing exemplary mourning of a devoted daughter destroyed by irreparable loss. I cried silently, discreetly, hot tears of genuine pain flowing soundlessly while I held my father's cold hand inside the simple lightwood casket during the final moments before they closed the lid definitively, whispering private goodbyes that no one else needed to hear besides him. And perhaps God, if he existed, listening to desperate prayers from adult orphan children? 2 weeks after the burial, when life began resuming the artificial normal rhythm of professional routines necessary for basic financial survival, Patricia contacted me formally through a cold, professional corporate email scheduling an urgent meeting at her private attorney's office to address pending succession matters according to testamentary documentation left by our deceased father. Legally formal, distant language that immediately lit subtle alarms of intuitive discomfort in my accounting-trained mind to detect suspicious documentary. I arrived punctually at the provided commercial address located in a luxurious, modern business building in an upscale central neighborhood where only large corporations and extremely financially successful liberal professionals could afford stratospheric monthly rents, feeling immediately displaced. Inadequate in the polished, mirrored marble lobby where uniformed security guards examined me distrustfully as if I were a potential intruder trying to inappropriately access exclusive environments. Patricia's private attorney's office was an intimidating, oppressively luxurious space decorated with dark noblewood furniture, shelves full of impressive leather-bound law books, framed diplomas and certifications covering entire walls establishing unquestionable professional credibility, floor-to-ceiling windows offering spectacular, panoramic views of the city extending infinitely under bright blue sky, cruelly contrasting with the interior emotional storm beginning to form, sensing serious problems approaching in the Patricia was already waiting, seated comfortably in a soft leather armchair beside a middle-aged man wearing an expensive dark suit, Dr. Armando Semthi, whose complicated surname I couldn't fully capture during rushed formal introductions. He radiating that arrogant professional confidence of expensive lawyers accustomed to winning legal battles through superior financial resources, crushing less economically equipped opponents. Deborah, thank you for arriving punctually. Let's address succession matters objectively, efficiently, to avoid unnecessarily prolonging painful bureaucratic processes constantly reminding us of our recent shared loss. Patricia began with a controlled, business-like voice, as if conducting a routine corporate meeting instead of a sensitive family discussion about paternal inheritance. Dr. Armando slid across the huge polished table, a thick manila envelope containing officially authenticated documents, notarial seals visible through superior quality translucent paper. My hand trembling slightly when grabbing the heavy envelope, instinctively sensing that the contents would fundamentally change my understanding of family relationships and my own blood sister's integrity. This is the public will officially drawn up by our father approximately 14 months ago according to visible stamped dating, appropriately registered at the competent notary's office, authenticated according to all legal requirements, rigorously fulfilled for unquestionable legal validity. She continued with that practiced, rehearsed professional tone sounding strangely artificial, considering she was discussing distribution of her own recently deceased father's estate. I opened the envelope with numb fingers, extracting a stack of pages printed on official letterhead paper from a recognized notary's office. Eyes quickly scanning legally complex text full of specific technical terminology designed to confuse unprepared laypeople, until I reached the crucial, devastating section detailing specific estate distribution. I leave to my daughter, Patricia Regina, I'll made 98% of the totality of my assets, rights and holdings, including fully paid residential property, motor vehicle, financial investments, furniture, personal objects, considering exceptional care, exemplary dedication and unconditional emotional support provided during the final years of my existence when health was progressively declining, requiring constant assistance that only she provided unselfishly. To my daughter, Deborah Cristina Almeida, I leave the remaining 2%, consisting of pending obligations including accumulated tax debts, unpaid personal loans, final hospital bills, Funeral expenses incurred. Recognizing that due to maintained emotional distance and physical absence during critical periods requiring family support, her participation in my life was considerably limited, reduced. The words danced blurred on the page through tears forming instantly. Free hand covering mouth involuntarily muffling strangled cry of incredulous shock trying to escape throat closing painfully. I reread the paragraph multiple times compulsively, obsessively trying to find a possible alternative interpretation. Grotesque typographical error. Cruel practical joke. Any explanation less devastating than the brutal reality indisputably printed on officially authenticated stamped document. My own father had left me only debts totaling approximately $52,000, while my sister inherited a house valued at approximately $350,000, a car worth $40,000, financial investments totaling $58,000, furniture and personal objects adding $15,000 additional. This can't be correct. It's impossible. Dad would never intentionally do this. He always explicitly repeatedly said during years that he would divide everything equally between us to regardless of any circumstance. Because he loved us exactly equal despite professional differences and divergent life choices. I managed to stammer finally when I recovered partially the ability to articulate coherent words through initial paralyzing shock. Patricia sighed dramatically, exaggeratedly, as if my reaction were childish, inappropriate, publicly embarrassing. Deborah, I understand it's difficult. Painful to accept that Dad finally recognized objectively differences in our filial dedication during his final years when he most needed constant practical support instead of brief sporadic visits between endless professional commitments that you consistently prioritized over family. She said with a voice impregnated with superior condescension, cruel, implicit judgment. I visited him daily without fail, even with an extremely demanding business schedule, brought carefully prepared home-cooked meals, organized numerous medical appointments, administered complex medications according to rigorous prescriptions. While you appeared occasionally bringing cheap flowers and spending 30 rushed minutes before running back to work alleging urgent, unavoidable commitments, Dad simply recognized testamentarily this obvious, factual, documentable reality. Her accusations were simultaneously partially true, but fundamentally distorted, cruelly manipulated to justify screaming injustice. It was true that I visited my father less frequently than Patricia during recent years due to considerable geographical distances and crushing workload necessary to keep tiny accounting office precariously functioning, covering basic survival expenses without superfluous luxuries. But I had never ever been a negligent, uninterested, emotionally distant daughter. I called him minimally 3 times, weekly conversing at length about his life, health, needs, concerns, visited personally at least twice monthly, spending entire weekends together watching old movies he loved, patiently cooking his favorite dishes, listening to stories repeated 1,000 times about his youth that never tired me because I genuinely loved that gentle man who raised me alone after losing his beloved wife prematurely. Patricia, you know perfectly, unquestionably, that this doesn't reflect the complete truth about the relationship we maintained with Dad. You're selectively distorting facts to justify this absurdly disproportionate distribution that completely contradicts everything he expressed verbally. During entire decades, I argued, trying to control growing tremor in voice, anger progressively boiling under surface of initial paralyzing shock. Dad explicitly said during his birthday dinner last year, in front of multiple witnesses, including his neighbors, that he intended to divide everything half and half between us, regardless of who visited more frequently, because family shouldn't be a commercial transaction measured quantitatively by invested hours, but unconditional love expressed qualitatively through genuine presence when possible. Dr. Armando interrupted gently but firmly with a professional voice trained to disarm emotional confrontations before they escalated uncontrollably. Ms. Deborah, I completely understand this situation is emotionally difficult, disturbing, possibly unexpected considering previous expectations. However, from a strictly legal juridical point of view, the presented will was appropriately drawn up following all required notarial protocols, contains the testator's authenticated signature, apparently in full mental faculties according to attached medical certification dated 3 weeks before testamentary drafting, appropriately witnessed by impartial notarial employees as Brazilian succession legislation unequivocally establishes, unless you possess concrete, substantial evidence of coercion, documentary fraud, proven mental incapacity of the testator at the specific moment of drafting. The document has legal presumption of validity that can only be judicially contested through complex, lengthy, expensive annulment action with relatively low statistical probability of success according to established jurisprudence in similar cases. His words fell like a final, definitive, irrevocable sentence over naive hopes of fair, amicable resolution. I was being legally, technically, bureaucratically crushed by a system designed favoring those who possess superior financial resources to hire expensive lawyers, manipulate official documents, exploit legal loopholes. I left that luxurious office emotionally, mentally staggering, destroyed, driving mechanically back to my tiny apartment while my mind spun frantically trying to process devastating reality. Not only had I lost my beloved father suddenly, but I was also being cruelly stripped of inheritance that should be mine by basic right as equally loved daughter, forced to assume substantial debts that would consume years of hard work to settle. While my sister literally swam in fraudulently inherited wealth through document manipulation that I still didn't completely understand how it had been executed, but instinctively, viscerally sensed in the essence of my soul that something was profoundly, fundamentally wrong with that supposedly authentic will. In the subsequent brutal months, financially and emotionally devastating. My life transformed into an endless Kafkaesque nightmare of succession bureaucracies, relentless collections from multiple creditors, sleepless nights obsessively calculating how I would manage to pay $52,000 in debts when my net monthly income oscillated precariously between $4,000 and $6,000 depending on quantity of monthly active clients. My father's house was sold quickly, efficiently by Patricia to anxious buyers paying full cash value, she depositing a tiny percentage corresponding to my supposed 2% deducted from administrative fees, taxes, commissions that further reduced the already derisory final amount, with money received from that sale and liquidation of his financial investments. Patricia bought an impressive mansion in a luxurious, gated community, renovated her aesthetic clinics installing extremely expensive imported latest generation equipment, traded her car for an ostentatious imported zero-mileage model, traveled to Europe with husband Rodrigo on prolonged 3-week vacations, staying at 5-star hotels, sharing offensive photographs on social media, showing expensive meals at Michelin-starred restaurants while I ate cheap instant noodles for dinner, working until dawn preparing tax returns for desperate The inherited debts became invisible but extremely heavy chains binding me in an endless, vicious cycle of exhausting work, constant material deprivation, crushing psychological stress, personal loan of $20,000 that my father had allegedly contracted for emergency residential renovations but never performed, raising suspicious questions about real destination of that money. Accumulated tax debts of $8,000, referring to delayed income tax returns from multiple years never properly filed. Final hospital bills totaling $13,000 for final palliative treatments not fully covered by deficient health insurance. Funeral expenses of $8,000, including casket, wake, burial, simple headstone, 1 negotiated long installments with all creditors, each monthly payment consuming 60 to 70% of my net income, leaving miserable amounts for basic food, modest rent, essential transportation, zero luxuries or occasional leisure to relieve stress, progressively accumulating, threatening complete psychological collapse. During that dark, endless period of 5 years, meticulously, religiously paying each installment of those unjust debts, while my sister ostentatiously displayed fraudulently inherited wealth, without showing apparent guilt or remorse, I maintained absolute distance from her, refusing occasional invitations to lunches at expensive restaurants, inauguration parties for her mansion renovations, pompous birthday celebrations where I would feel constantly humiliated by the obscene disparity between our divergent financial conditions. She interpreted my distancing as childish resentment, inability to accept supposed reality that our father had justly chosen to recognize her superior dedication through legitimate will, never demonstrating or questioning if perhaps, possibly, remotely there could be something questionable, manipulated, fraudulent in that conveniently too favorable document, disproportionately favoring her while leaving me drowning in a sea of debts that consumed every drop of vital energy daily. But something inside me, a persistent spark of righteous indignation, refusing to completely extinguish even under crushing weight of constant financial adversity, insistently whispered that that will was forged, manipulated, fundamentally fraudulent. My father would never, ever have intentionally left me only debts after a lifetime demonstrating equal paternal love for both daughters. Despite different personalities, divergent professional choices, contrasting lifestyles. He was a fundamentally fair man, balanced, equitable in all aspects of life, always dividing desserts equally when we were children, fighting over the bigger piece of cake, always ensuring both received gifts of equivalent value on birthdays to avoid natural fraternal jealousy, always mediating conflicts between us with wise Solomonic impartiality. This same man had supposedly decided suddenly, radically in his final months of life, that one daughter deserved 98% of everything while the other deserved only debts. The emotional mathematics simply didn't calculate logically, didn't make coherent narrative sense with the man I knew intimately during 42 entire years of loving coexistence. At the end of the fifth, exhausting, draining year of constant financial sacrifices, multiple material deprivations, accumulated psychological stress permanently threatening my precarious mental health, I made the final payment, completely settling all unjustly inherited debts. $52,000 paid religiously through 60 painful monthly installments subtracted from modest income, leaving me perpetually living at the absolute limit of basic survival without any financial cushion for unexpected emergencies or small occasional pleasures. Alleviating gray monotony of existence, reduced to working, eating minimally, sleeping insufficiently, repeating that night, sitting alone in the silent tiny apartment, lit only by a weak lamp occasionally flickering, threatening to burn out definitively, I prepared calming chamomile tea, contemplating 5 wasted years paying debts that fundamentally, viscerally, intuitively, I believed shouldn't have been my legal responsibility, while my sister lived luxuriously in wealth inherited through a document that every fiber of my being insisted was convincingly fraudulent, but unequivocally fraudulent. It was then, in that quiet moment of exhausted reflection after years of solitary struggle, that I made a definitive, transformative, irrevocable decision. I would use minuscule savings finally beginning to accumulate after settling oppressive debts to hire a true specialist, attorney in testamentary contestations and document forgeries, meticulously investigate that suspicious will, judicially prove what my heart already knew unquestionably to be true, that Patricia had manipulated, forged, adulterated a fraudulent document exploiting our father's vulnerability, during final cognitive decline cruelly stealing from me legitimate inheritance, while simultaneously drowning me in ocean of conveniently fabricated debts. I would no longer be a passive, resigned, silent victim accepting grotesque injustice simply because the legal system favored those who possessed superior resources. I would fight strategically, intelligently, relentlessly to recover not just stolen money, but mainly violated dignity. Denied justice. Truth suppressed during 5 endless years of unnecessary suffering, cruelly imposed by who should be loyal blood ally instead of greedy adversary, devoid of conscience or basic family empathy. The search for a competent specialist attorney within severely limited budget was substantial, challenge requiring extensive research. Multiple free initial consultations evaluating professional competence and personal compatibility, until I finally found Dr. Walter Enriquekemp, 57-year-old attorney specialized precisely in complex inheritance law and testamentary contestations involving suspicions of document forgery or undue coercion of vulnerable testators. His office contrasted dramatically with the intimidating, luxurious environment of Patricia's attorney, located in an old, modest commercial building in a peripheral neighborhood needing evident renovations. Functional decoration without superfluous ostentation. Shelves full of cheaply bound but evidently used law books according to numerous colored bookmarks projecting between pages. Simply framed diplomas hanging slightly crooked on walls painted too long ago, displaying discreet moisture stains in upper corners. Dr. Walter was a man of slightly disheveled, but professionally trustworthy appearance. Wavy gray hair falling slightly over the collar of a white shirt, slightly yellowed by time but impeccably clean and ironed. Worn tortoise-shell-framed glasses resting on an aquiline nose, while dark brown eyes examined me with penetrating but not intimidating intensity. Short-trimmed gray beard, but not completely close-shaven, conferring appearance of experienced intellectual dedicated to the cause of justice instead of ostentatious material wealth accumulation. Miss Deborah, thank you for arriving punctually and trusting me enough to share your painful story. He began with a surprisingly gentle, warm voice contrasting with the modest physical environment of the small but functional office where he had worked for 3 decades defending wronged heirs like me. Before we begin detailed analysis of your specific case, I need you to fundamentally understand my professional philosophy that absolutely guides all my work for 32 consecutive years practicing specialized inheritance law. He paused, serving strong, bitter black coffee in slightly chipped but clean white porcelain cups. Simple but comforting gesture of basic hospitality that immediately made me feel less displaced, less judged by the precarious financial condition that forced me to seek an attorney in a peripheral neighborhood instead of luxurious offices and business centers where my sister hired expensive legal services. The coffee was hot, comforting, exactly what I needed in that moment of exposed vulnerability. I chose to specialize in inheritance law, not because it's a lucrative or prestigious area. Clearly, it's not as evidenced by the modesty of this office, but because I personally witnessed during my own youth how unjust testamentary disputes can devastate entire families, destroy fraternal relationships that should be sacred, financially ruin honest people while enriching manipulators without moral scruples. Dr. Walton narrated, voice loaded with deep conviction, born of painful personal experience. My own father was a victim of a scheme similar to what you're describing. My paternal uncle manipulated a will during my grandfather's progressive cognitive decline, leaving my father practically disinherited while he kept valuable rural properties that should have been equitably divided among brothers. I witnessed my father, an honest, hard-working man who had never intentionally harmed anyone, being publicly humiliated, financially ruined, emotionally destroyed by family betrayal he considered impossible to happen. His words resonated deeply with my own recent traumatic experience, creating immediate connection of mutual understanding based on similar pains, lived in different generations but fundamentally identical in devastating emotional essence. I felt tears forming again in corners of tired eyes, but this time they weren't just tears of paralyzing sadness, but also tentative relief, finding someone who genuinely understood without need for elaborate explanations. I spent subsequent years obsessively studying inheritance law, specializing in detecting testamentary fraud, contesting manipulated documents, defending legitimate heirs against greedy relatives exploiting vulnerabilities of elderly or cognitively compromised test. I didn't become rich doing this, probably would have 10 times more assets if I had chosen corporate or tax law, but I sleep peacefully every night knowing my daily work makes tangible difference in lives of people unjustly devastated like you. Dr. Walter opened a drawer of the old dark wood desk scratched by decades of use, extracting a thick folder full of yellowed newspaper clippings, faded photographs, old legal documents, carefully preserved in transparent, protective plastic. This folder contains cases I've won over 3 decades, each document representing a restored family, justice accomplished, manipulator held accountable. I like to revisit them occasionally when particularly difficult cases temporarily discourage me, reminding myself why I chose this specific professional path. He carefully spread some documents over the table between us, pointing to photographs of ordinary people whose stories probably mirrored mine in endured pain and injustice. This one here was a case from 2007. Older brother forged a will, leaving younger sister only debts, while he kept 3 valuable commercial properties. It took 4 years of meticulous investigation and exhausting judicial battles. But eventually we proved forgery through advanced handwriting analysis and testimonies from notary office employees who admitted being bribed to authenticate fraudulent documents. My heart accelerated, hopefully hearing a story similar to mine resulting in judicial victory eventually achieved despite prolonged difficulties. In this case, from 2011, nephew manipulated an elderly aunt with advanced Alzheimer's to alter will days before she died, leaving him as sole beneficiary while her biological children were completely We managed to annul the will, demonstrating testator's mental incapacity at the moment of drafting through contemporary medical reports and testimonies from professional caregivers who attested to her severely compromised cognitive state. Each briefly narrated story planted additional seeds of hope in the arid terrain of my heart, destroyed by years of uncontested injustice, demonstrating concretely that victories were possible despite frequently discouraging, unfavorable statistical probabilities. Dr. Walter wasn't selling cheap false hopes, but sharing tangible evidence of previous proven successes carefully, preserved documentarily. Now, tell me in detail absolutely everything about your specific case, starting from your relationship with your father during his life, family dynamics with your sister over decades, specific circumstances preceding his sudden death, how you learned about the questionable will, and especially any detail, however minor it seems, about your father's behavior or health in the final months preceding death. Dr. Walter instructed, opening an old but functional laptop, preparing to meticulously note every relevant information provided during the narrative that would extend over the next intense hours. I breathed deeply, mentally organizing years of complex family memories before beginning extensive and painfully detailed chronological account. My father Mauricio was a fundamentally fair man, balanced, equitable in absolutely all his personal and family relationships during 73 years of honest and hardworking life. He worked 45 consecutive years as administrative manager in a medium-sized metallurgical industry, religiously waking at 5:30 every morning for decades to be punctually at work at 7 o'clock, never missing a single day except when absolutely necessary due to serious illness or unavoidable family emergencies. He was a dedicated but not permissive father, establishing clear limits for me and my sister Patricia during our childhood and adolescence, but always patiently explaining reasons behind imposed rules instead of simply demanding blind authoritarian obedience. I vividly remember him sitting with me at the dinner table when I was maybe 10 or 11 years old, carefully explaining the importance of saving part of the weekly allowance received instead of spending it all immediately on candy and temporary toys, basic financial lesson that fundamentally shaped my relationship with money during entire adult life. Dr. Walter noted rapidly, but occasionally interrupted with specific clarifying questions, exploring nuances and additional details he considered potentially legally relevant. Did your father demonstrate visible preference for one daughter over the other during your childhood and adolescence? Any indication of systematic favoritism that could eventually justify disproportionate estate distribution alleged in the questionable will? Absolutely not. Never, I responded emphatically, with absolute certainty, born of decades of direct observation and crystal-clear memories preserved intact. Dad was meticulously fair in distribution of attention, resources, opportunities between us two. If he bought a gift for one of us on a special date, he ensured the other received a gift of approximate equivalent value on the same occasion to avoid natural childhood jealousy. If he praised one's academic achievement, he actively sought reasons to equally praise the other in a different area where she I continued narrating specific episodes illustrating my father's fair and equitable character during years of close family coexistence, establishing consistent behavioral pattern completely incompatible with disproportionate will, allegedly, authentically leaving one daughter with 9% while the other received only accumulated debts. Dr. Walter absorbed every provided detail, occasionally requesting additional clarifications about specific chronologies or presence of witnesses who could eventually corroborate. Presented narratives. After our mother died prematurely from cancer 8 years ago, my father was visibly emotionally shaken, but maintained functional independence, living alone in the small apartment he had shared with her during decades of happy marriage, firmly but gently refusing multiple offers from both me and Patricia to move to either of our homes, alleging he valued personal autonomy while physical and mental health allowed maintaining basic domestic routines independently. I narrated, voice slightly catching, remembering his visible loneliness after losing his life companion. I visited him regularly, as permitted by considerable geographical distances, and intense professional demands of my self-employed accounting work that frequently required irregular hours and tight, unavoidable deadlines. I called him minimally 3 times weekly, conversing at length about his daily life, health, concerns, emerging needs. Visited personally at least twice monthly, spending entire weekends together watching old movies he loved, patiently cooking his favorite dishes, listening to repeated stories about his youth and relationship with our mother that I never tired of hearing. Patricia, residing geographically closer in a neighborhood adjacent to his and possessing greater schedule flexibility as owner of aesthetic clinics where she delegated operational responsibilities to hired managers, visited him more frequently than me, statistically speaking, perhaps 4 or 5 times weekly according to what she constantly claimed during occasional family gatherings. Initially, I interpreted this as genuine demonstration of filial dedication deserving admiration instead of raising suspicions about potentially manipulative hidden motivations. Dr. Walter gently interrupted, raising crucial question I hadn't sufficiently considered during preceding years. During these frequent visits your sister made alone to your father without your presence as direct witness, do you have specific knowledge of which activities they performed together, subjects discussed, documents potentially signed, financial decisions made, any indication she was gradually socially isolating him from other family members or friends, establishing emotional and practical dependence exclusively on her? At the time, these scenes seemed admirable demonstrations of dedicated daughter assisting elderly father with administrative tasks increasingly difficult for him to manage. Independently due to mild cognitive decline typical of natural aging, I never specifically questioned which documents exactly they were reviewing or signing, because I implicitly trusted both her and his mental capacity to protect his own financial interests against external manipulation even from family. Clearly, I grossly underestimated his progressive vulnerability and her predatory intentions masked under facade of genuine filial assistance. Dr. Walter was noting furiously now, recognizing familiar patterns of gradual manipulation he had seen repeatedly in dozens of similar cases over decades of specialized practice. This is Classic textbook pattern of progressive family manipulation, establishing control over a vulnerable testator. First, establish practical dependence, genuinely helping with legitimately difficult daily administrative tasks. Gradually socially isolating from other family members and friends through subtle suggestions that others don't care sufficiently or are too busy to help adequately. Eventually, introducing discussions about succession planning under pretext of being sensible, responsible precaution. Finally, manipulating testamentary documentation, disproportionately favoring manipulator. In the last 6 to 8 months preceding my father's sudden death, I noticed worrying but not alarming enough changes to intervene, assertively investigating specific underlying causes. I continued narrating with growing discomfort, retrospectively recognizing missed signs that should have alerted suspicions earlier. He seemed progressively more confused about specific dates, repeated stories he had told literally days before as if they were new, occasionally forgot names of people known for decades, including close neighbors and retired colleagues with whom he maintained lasting friendships. I attributed these manifestations to normal cognitive aging, typical of people entering their 8th decade of life. Nothing particularly alarming, necessitating urgent medical intervention or raising red flags about mental capacity to make important financial or testamentary decisions with permanent consequences. Patricia repeatedly minimized concerns I expressed occasionally, alleging Dad was perfectly fine mentally, just having sporadic episodes of benign forgetfulness completely normal for his age, actively discouraging suggestions I made about consulting a neurologist for objective formal cognitive evaluation. Retrospectively, I now realize that this persistent minimization of my legitimate concerns about his cognitive decline served her manipulative interests. Keeping the situation unexamined professionally by specialist doctors who could officially document progressive mental incapacity, potentially invalidating any will drawn during a period of clinically demonstrable cognitive impairment. She needed him to seem sufficiently mentally capable superficially to validate fraudulent testamentary documentation, but simultaneously sufficiently cognitively compromised to easily manipulate signature on documents whose real content he probably didn't completely understand. Dr. Walter momentarily paused, notes, looking directly at me with expression mixing human compassion and fierce professional determination. Deborah, based on everything you've described so far, I have substantial professional conviction that your father was a victim of systematic manipulation during period of cognitive vulnerability cynically exploited by your sister to fabricate fraudulent will disproportionately favoring her. However, personal moral conviction is insufficient for court. We need concrete, tangible, objectively verifiable evidence to build legally robust case capable of annulling questionable will and restoring equitable estate. Distribution according to his genuine will would have been if expressed in full mental capacity. We'll need multiple lines of evidence converging coherently. First, medical documentation establishing progressive cognitive decline during specific period when will was allegedly drawn. You mentioned he visited doctors regularly. We need to obtain all medical records from last 2 years of his life, including any neurological evaluations, cognitive tests, prescriptions for medications potentially affecting mental capacity. Doctors can be extremely powerful witnesses, establishing testamentary incapacity if contemporary records document significant cognitive impairment. Second, expert handwriting analysis comparing signature on questionable will with his authentic signatures on various documents over preceding years. Even if signature is genuinely as technically experts can detect tremors, hesitation, irregularities indicating he signed without truly understanding content or under subtle psychological coercion. Third, testimonies from people who regularly interacted with your father during final months, neighbors, friends, retired colleagues, healthcare professionals, establishing pattern of growing mental confusion, incompatible with capacity to consciously make complex testamentary decision. Fourth, and potentially most devastating for a case, investigation of specific circumstances of testamentary drafting, which notary exactly, which employees were present. If there was a doctor providing mental capacity certification as frequently required for wills of elderly people, if genuine impartial witnesses were present, or if they were people connected to your sister, potentially accomplices in fraud, notaries maintain detailed records. We can judicially request copies of absolutely all related documentation, including security videos, if they exist showing your father during drafting process. The magnitude of necessary investigation seemed simultaneously encouraging in meticulous comprehensiveness and intimidating in technical complexity and potentially prohibitive financial costs accumulated over months or years of investigative work and prolonged judicial battles. Dr. Walter, I need to be completely honest about severe financial limitations I currently face After 5 entire years paying unjustly inherited debts, consuming practically all my monthly available income, savings I managed to finally accumulate after debt settlement are modest, sufficient perhaps to cover initial costs of preliminary investigation, but insufficient to sustain legal battle, potentially extending for years with accumulating attorney fees, specialized expert costs, multiple court fees. Dr. Walter smiled understandingly, expression conveying he had anticipated exactly this legitimate financial objection. Deborah! I work primarily with clients in difficult financial situations, precisely because they're victims of estate manipulations, leaving them unjustly impoverished. My fee structure reflects this reality. I charge a modest initial retainer covering preliminary case analysis and first investigative steps, then a contingent percentage of amount eventually recovered through testamentary annulment and equitable estate redistribution. If we don't recover anything, you owe nothing beyond initial retainer already paid. Specifically for your case, considering particularly unjust circumstances and preliminary evidence suggesting strong probability of eventual success, I propose a retainer of $8,000 covering initial 3 months of intensive investigative work, including obtaining medical records, hiring trustworthy handwriting expert who works regularly with me, preliminary investigation of notary, and employees involved in questionable testamentary drafting. If at end of those 3 months we determine case has sufficient legal merit to proceed judicially, I continue working on contingent percentage of 25% of any amount recovered through favorable judicial decision. The proposal was financially viable within limited resources I had painfully accumulated over recent months of extreme economy, and contingent fee structure perfectly aligned his interest with my own, ensuring he was genuinely motivated to win the case instead of simply accumulating billable hours indefinitely without real commitment to positive final outcome. I accept your proposed terms. Dr. Walter, I have $8,000 saved that I can pay immediately, initiating urgently needed investigative work. I responded with firm voice, carrying renewed determination, fueled by realistic hope born of his genuine professional expertise instead of cheap, empty promises. Excellent. We'll begin immediately judicially requesting all your father's medical records from last 3 years of life through court order. I'll quickly obtain given nature of case and demonstrable legitimate need for access to records normally protected by medical confidentiality. Simultaneously, you'll provide exemplars of his authentic signatures from various periods old, canceled checks, official documents, handwritten personal letters, which I'll use to contract comparative handwriting analysis by investigator Sylvia Medeiros, judicial expert specialist who has worked with me for 15 years on complex succession cases. Dr. Walter extracted standardized contract forms from drawer, filling relevant fields with specific information from my case, while patiently explaining each clause, ensuring complete understanding of mutually agreed terms before requesting signature formalizing professional attorney-client relationship. This contract establishes scope of services, fee structure, as discussed, absolute confidentiality protecting sensitive information shared during course of representation, and procedures for resolution of any disputes through arbitration instead of public litigation. If disagreements arise about case conduct or division of recovered amounts, incoming days. I'll prepare initial petition requesting will annulment for consent, defect resulting from testator's mental incapacity and or undue coercion exercised by disproportionate beneficiary, legally grounding arguments in established jurisprudential precedents and specialized doctrine in inheritance law. You'll receive preliminary copy for review and approval before officially filing in competent court, formally initiating judicial process that will probably extend 12 to 18 months until final definitive judgment, considering typical complexities of contested succession cases. I left Dr. Walter's modest office, feeling for the first time in years the crushing weight of suffered injustice, slightly lightening replaced by renewed determination, fueled by realistic hope that justice, though delayed, would be eventually achieved through legal system when appropriately navigated by experienced professional, genuinely dedicated. The exterior sky had darkened during hours we spent discussing minute case details, urban lights beginning to illuminate busy streets full of people returning from honest jobs to welcoming homes, where they probably didn't need to contemplate devastating family betrayals, destroying relationships that should be eternally sacred. That night, lying awake in the uncomfortable bed of my tiny apartment, hearing nocturnal urban sounds filtering through thin windows offering inadequate acoustic insulation, I felt for the first time in 5 long years something beyond resigned despair or impotent anger constantly boiling under surface of precariously maintained professional functionality. I felt genuine hope tempered by realism about substantial challenges still ahead but grounded in Dr. Walter's trustworthy professional expertise and preliminary evidence suggesting judicial victory wasn't impossible. Fantasy but achievable goal through persistent hard work, disciplined patience, unshakable faith in justice, eventually prevailing over criminal manipulation when appropriately confronted through proper legal channels competently navigated. In weeks subsequent to hiring Dr. Walter, my life transformed into a whirlwind of meticulously coordinated investigative activity. I rummaged through dusty drawers, cardboard boxers forgotten in closets, looking for old documents from my father containing authentic signatures from different periods. Each discovery being carefully photographed, chronologically cataloged, digitally sent to Dr. Walter, building robust comparative timeline. I found canceled checks from preceding years, manually signed income tax returns dating back 15 years, handwritten letters he had sent when occasionally traveling, visiting distant relatives. Each item representing additional piece of complex puzzle we patiently assembled. Dr. Walter worked quickly, obtaining court order, authorizing complete access to my father's medical records from last 3 years of life. Documents arriving via registered mail, an officially sealed thick envelope containing hundreds of pages of clinical notes, laboratory test results, medication prescriptions, specialized consultation reports. We spent an entire afternoon in his office meticulously reviewing each page, highlighting relevant passages indicating progressive cognitive decline. Geriatric doctor's notes mentioning episodes of growing temporal confusion, prescription of medication, too slow progression of initial dementia diagnosed 8 months before his death. Neurological report from 6 months pre-death documenting low score on standardized cognitive tests, indicating significant mental impairment incompatible with capacity to consciously make complex decisions. This medical documentation is pure gold, legally speaking. Dr. Walter commented enthusiastically, methodically organizing papers into categorized piles over the desk already overloaded with case documents, especially this neurological report from 6 months before his death, showing a score of 18 out of 30 on the mini mental state examination, a score indicating moderate cognitive impairment according to internationally established clinical standards. The will was drawn exactly 5 months before his death. Therefore, only 1 month after neurological evaluation, documenting substantial mental income. Any minimally competent judge will see obvious temporal correlation between documented cognitive impairment and testamentary drafting disproportionately benefiting daughter who controlled his access to medical professionals and financial institutions. Simultaneously, Dr. Walter coordinated handwriting analysis with investigators Sylvia 40-9-year-old forensic expert, whose impeccable professional reputation was widely recognized in specialized forensic community. I met with her personally in a small but technologically advanced laboratory equipped with sophisticated digital microscopes, high-resolution scanners, specialized software for comparative analysis of handwriting patterns. Sylvia was a meticulous woman with black skin, short, practical, curly hair, intensely focused, dark brown eyes, trained to detect microscopic minutiae invisible to common naked eye. Handwriting analysis is rigorous forensic science based on decades of internationally validated research, not subjective guesswork or arbitrary personal opinion. Sylvia explained while positioning the signature from the questionable will under a digital microscope, projecting dramatically enlarged image on a large monitor mounted on laboratory wall. Each person develops unique handwriting patterns over lifetime through thousands of repetitions, creating specific muscle memory consistently manifested in objectively measurable characteristics. Pressure applied when writing, execution, speed, inclination angles, relative proportions between letters, connections between characters, beginning and ending of strokes. She digitized all authentic signatures from my father that I had provided. SOFTWARE, automatically analyzing thousands of comparative data points, identifying consistent statistical patterns over years, establishing his normal behavioral baseline. Observe here. Sylvia pointed to complex graphs displayed on screen showing overlays of multiple signatures, revealing impressive consistencies. All his authentic signatures from period when he was cognitively healthy show consistently shared characteristics. Uniform pressure maintained during complete execution. Fluid speed without hesitations. Constant inclination of approximately 15 degrees to right. Specific proportions between height of uppercase and lowercase letters. Now compared with signature on questionable will, she continued enlarging image of disputed signature showing microscopic details normally invisible. Observe visible tremors in multiple strokes indicating hesitation or loss of fine motor control typical of neurological decline. Dramatic variations in applied pressure suggesting fatigue or confusion during execution. Interruptions in strokes where pen was lifted and repositioned multiple times instead of continuous fluid movement characteristic of his authentic signatures. Additionally, proportions between letters are significantly distorted compared with established baseline. An inclination varies uncontrollably throughout signature instead of maintaining consistent angle Sylvia paused dramatically before pronouncing preliminary conclusion that validated viscerally intuited suspicions for years, based on detailed comparative technical analysis applying internationally scientifically validated methodology. My professional expert opinion is that although signature on questionable will is technically authentic, meaning it was physically executed by your father's hand, it presents unequivocal characteristics of severe impairment during execution. Person who signed this document was experiencing significant tremors, loss of fine motor control, confusion or disorientation manifested in multiple interruptions and corrections. In layman's language, your father technically signed this document personally, but objective handwriting evidence strongly indicates that during signing he was not in full mental faculties necessary to truly understand what he was signing. Sylvia's formal expert report, 32-page technical document full of comparative graphs, statistical analyses, enlarged photographs revealing microscopic minutiae, was delivered to Dr. Walter 3 weeks after initial analysis, representing objective scientific evidence corroborating medical documentation, establishing my father's testamentary incapacity during drafting a fraudulent document disproportionately benefiting Patricia. Dr. Walter incorporated an expert report into initial petition already meticulously prepared, 147-page legal document grounded in established jurisprudential precedents, specialized inheritance, law doctrine, applicable civil legislation, formally requesting will annulment for consent defect resulting from testator's mental incapacity and coercion exercised by disproportionate beneficiary. The initial petition was officially filed in competent court on a rainy Tuesday in September, formally initiating judicial process that would fundamentally, irreversibly alter trajectory of our family lives. Patricia was judicially summoned 2 weeks later. Officer of Justice personally delivering at her luxurious mansion an envelope containing complete copy of initial petition detailing serious accusations of fraudulent manipulation of cognitively vulnerable testator to obtain disproportionate estate advantage through cruel exploitation of elderly father in progressive mental decline. I imagined her expression receiving summons, mask of arrogant superiority, momentarily cracking, revealing underlying panic when she finally understood. I hadn't resignedly accepted perpetrated injustice, but was fighting strategically, legally, relentlessly, to restore estate equity cynically stolen from her. Her response arrived within established legal deadline, elaborated by the same expensive attorney Dr. Armando whose luxurious office I had visited years ago during initial revelation of fraudulent will. 83-page legal document vehemently denying all presented accusations, alleging will had been drawn voluntarily, consciously by our father in full mental faculties exercising legitimate right to dispose of estate as desired, rewarding dedicated daughter who provided exemplary care during his final years while other daughters maintained emotional and physical distance, prioritizing professional career over basic family responsibilities. The response attacked credibility of handwriting analysis, alleging observed tremors were consistent with natural aging typical of 73-year-old man instead of indicating specific cognitive impairment, and questioned interpretation of medical records alleging initial dementia diagnosis didn't automatically mean complete testamentary incapacity. Dr. Walter wasn't minimally surprised by presented defensive arguments, had anticipated exactly these lines of counter-argumentation based on decades of experience litigating similar succession cases. Her response is exactly what I expected. Generic denials without real substance. Technical attacks on credibility of expert evidence without presenting own Sylvia's specific conclusions, emotional distortions attempting to justify disproportionate distribution through narrative of dedicated daughter versus negligent daughter that doesn't correspond to objectively documented reality. He critically analyzed during meeting in his office, reviewing subsequent strategy. Next crucial phase will be instruction and trial hearing, where we'll present witnesses corroborating your father's cognitive decline and your sister's pattern of progressive manipulation, besides submitting both medical and handwriting expertise to direct judicial scrutiny through interrogations of experts by both sides. The instruction and trial hearing was finally scheduled for a Thursday morning in March at Family and Succession Court. Austere but imposing room formally decorated with heavy darkwood furniture. National flag hanging behind judge's elevated bench. Judicial coat of arms prominently mounted on wall transmitting solemn authority of state adjudicating disputes between citizens. I arrived early, accompanied by Dr. Walter, conservatively dressed in discreet outfit conveying professional respectability, heart beating, acceleratedly anticipating direct judicial confrontation with Patricia for first time since initial discovery of testamentary fraud years ago. She arrived minutes later accompanied by Dr. Armando and husband Rodrigo, elaborately dressed in obviously expensive recognizable designer outfit, professionally applied makeup, emanating superficial confidence masking underlying nervousness visible through compulsive gestures, repeatedly adjusting perfect hair and examining impeccable nails. Judge Helena Fonseca entered punctually at 9 o'clock. Impressive 61-year-old woman with silver gray hair, cut in classic, elegant bob, penetrating green eyes that carefully examined room, evaluating participants before sitting in elevated chair behind imposing bench. Good morning to everyone present at this instruction and trial, hearing of process number such relative to contestation of public will drawn by deceased Mauricio Silva Almeida. She began with firm, authoritative but not hostile voice, establishing immediate control over proceedings. Before initiating evidentiary instruction with witness testimonies and expert interrogations, I wish to clarify that this court takes extremely seriously allegations of fraudulent manipulation of vulnerable testators, despicable practice that violates fundamental principles of testamentary autonomy and protection of elderly against abusive family exploitation. Simultaneously, I recognize that wills validly executed by testators in full mental faculties deserve judicial protection against frivolous motivated by family resentments or legitimately frustrated estate expectations. It falls to plaintiff Deborah to prove preponderance of evidence that questioned will was product of mental incapacity and or undue coercion. Significant, but not impossible, evidentiary burden to satisfy through medical documentary, handwriting expert, testimonial evidence coherently converging. Dr. Walter methodically presented case over following hours, beginning with medical documentation, establishing my father's progressive cognitive decline, culminating in formal diagnosis of initial dementia, 8 months preceding death, emphasizing neurological report from 6 months pre-death, documenting low score on cognitive tests, indicating moderate mental impairment occurring only 1 month before questionable testamentary drafting. Geriatric doctor who had treated my father in last 2 years of life was called a specialized witness, testifying under oath that progressively observed cognitive decline was consistent with initial vascular dementia affecting judgment capacity, memory, understanding of complex concepts like permanent testamentary implications. Under aggressive cross-examination by Dr. Armando, attempting to discredit his opinion, doctor remained firm, professionally affirming that although patient maintained basic functionality in routine daily activities, capacity for complex decisions involving financial and succession planning was significantly compromised during relevant period. Investigator Sylvia testified extensively about handwriting analysis, projecting enlarged images of comparative signatures on large screen mounted in room, allowing judge and all parties to directly visualize, technically discuss characteristics. She patiently explained scientific methodology, employed international validation of utilized techniques, statistical significance of observed deviations between authentic signatures from healthy periods and signature unquestionable will exhibiting tremors, hesitations, pressure variations, indicative of impairment during execution. Dr. Armando vigorously tried to discredit her conclusions during prolonged cross-examination, suggesting observed differences were explainable by natural aging, temporary fatigue, or normal random variations in any signature sample collected over years. Sylvia calmly, professionally responded to each objection with detailed technical explanations grounded in decades of expert experience and established scientific literature, maintaining impressive credibility under intense adversarial pressure. Most dramatic moment of hearing occurred when Judge Helena requested that both Patricia and I personally testify under oath, directly interrogated by her about respective relationships with our father, frequency and quality of interactions during his final years, specific knowledge about his mental health, and circumstances involving testamentary drafting. I was called first, nervously walking to witness chair strategically positioned, allowing judge to directly observe facial expressions and body language, while answering carefully formulated questions exploring motivations, credibility, coherence of allegations formally presented in initial petition. Miss Deborah, please explain to me in your own words without legal jargon, what was the nature of the relationship you maintained with your deceased father during the last years of his life? Judge Helena began gently but firmly, penetrating green eyes, examining me, evaluating sincerity while I responded carefully but honestly. I described frequent phone calls, regular visits within realistic geographical and professional limitations, consistent demonstrations of genuine filial affection through small but significant gestures like cooking his favorite dishes, repeatedly watching preferred movies without complaining, patiently listening to repeated stories countless times because I valued underlying emotional connection instead of focusing on superficial narrative redundancy. Patricia was subsequently called, confidently walking to witness chair with erect, haughty posture. But I observed subtle signs of nervousness betraying control facade, fingers lightly drumming on chair arm, slightly accelerated breathing visible through almost imperceptible chest movements, eyes occasionally avoiding direct eye contact with judge when questions became particularly penetrating, exploring inconsistencies in defensively presented narrative. Miss Patricia, you allege in your formal response that you provided exemplary care to your father during his final years, justifying disproportionate testamentary recognition. Describe specifically which care you provided beyond frequently mentioned visits. Judge Helena questioned directly, forcing concrete verifiable details instead of vague, unproven allegations. Patricia elaborated extensively about prepared meals, organized medical appointments, administered medications, provided company during his loneliness after widowhood, painting portrait of devoted daughter, sacrificing substantial personal time and energy, altruistically caring for elderly father needing increasing assistance. And during these frequent and prolonged interactions, did you observe progressive cognitive decline in him during months preceding will drafting, benefiting you with 98% of his estate? Judge continued, green eyes fixating intensely on her carefully evaluating response. Patricia hesitated momentarily before responding calculatedly that Dad was mentally lucid during testamentary drafting, just experiencing occasional benign forgetfulness typical of advanced age, but fully maintaining capacity to consciously express testamentary wishes. The response directly contradicted contemporaneously documented medical evidence and multiple testimonies. His significant mental confusion during relevant period, inconsistency, Judge Helena visibly noted in notebook, while Patricia responded defensively, I find it interesting, Ms. Patricia, that you characterize your father's cognitive decline as merely occasional benign forgetfulness when contemporary medical records document formal diagnosis of initial vascular dementia 8 months preceding his death and worrying scored on neurological tests 6 months pre. How do you reconcile your minimizing characterization with objective medical evidence professionally documented? Judge pressed. Voice maintaining professional tone, but clearly skeptical about presented testimony credibility. Patricia verbally stumbled, trying to explain contradiction, alleging doctors frequently exaggerated diagnoses by excess of caution, that she interacted daily with him knowing his real condition better than medical professionals, who examined him only briefly during sporadic consultations. That testamentary capacity didn't require cognitive perfection, but only sufficient basic understanding of implications of taken decisions. After hours of testimonies, interrogations, exhaustive cross-examinations, Judge Helena closed instruction, hearing announcing she would carefully analyze totality of presented evidence before delivering definitive sentence with an established legal deadline of 30 days. I thank all parties, witnesses, experts for cooperation during prolonged but necessary hearing to elucidate complex questions involved in this sensitive case of family testamentary disputes. I'll deliver grounded sentence considering totality of documentary, expert, testimonial evidence presented evaluated through legal standards established in civil legislation and consolidated jurisprudence about testamentary capacity requirements and vulnerable testators' protection against undue exploitation. She formally concluded before withdrawing from room, leaving us anxiously awaiting verdict that would finally determine justice or perpetuation of devastating family injustice. The subsequent 30 days awaiting sentence were a period of intense anxiety oscillating between hope grounded in robust, presented evidence and paralyzing fear that judicial system would fail. Recognizing fraudulent manipulation cynically perpetrated by Patricia, Dr. Walter kept me regularly informed, expressing professional confidence based on decades of experience that Judge Helena had demonstrated during hearing appropriate skepticism about Patricia's defensive narrative and visibly impressed herself with coherent convergence of medical handwriting, testimonial evidence, establishing my father's testamentary incapacity and pattern of progressive control, exercised by her during his vulnerable period. The sentence was officially published exactly 28 days after hearing, 63-page legal document, meticulously grounded, detailedly analyzing evidence presented by both sides, applicable jurisprudential precedents, guiding doctrinal principles. Dr. Walter called me immediately after learning through electronic process tracking system, voice loaded with deep satisfaction announcing, Deborah, we won completely. Judge Helena integrally annulled the fraudulent will, determined equitable estate redistribution according to standard succession legislation, dividing inheritance half and half between you and your sister, condemned Patricia to return all unduly received amounts plus monetary correction and interest since original date of disproportionate distribution, and still condemned her to pay attorney fees and procedural costs for having perpetrated testamentary fraud through exploitation of cognitively vulnerable testator. I slowly sat on the floor of modest apartment where I had lived solitarily during years of desperate financial struggle, tears flowing uncontrollably, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief and deep validation finally achieved after long, exhausting, frequently discouraging journey through complex legal system, competently navigated by attorney genuinely dedicated to justice instead of just personal profit. Justice had ultimately prevailed over criminal manipulation when appropriately confronted through objective scientific evidence, multiple corroborating testimonies, solidly grounded legal argumentation. I read sentence integrally multiple times, savoring each word carefully chosen by Judge Helena, validating viscerally intuited suspicions for years, based on detailed analysis of totality of documentary, expert and testimonial evidence presented during procedural instruction. This court concludes by convincing preponderance of proof that public will drawn in name of deceased Mauricio Silva. Almeida was product of consent defect resulting from testator's progressive mental incapacity during relevant period and undue coercion exercised by defendant Patricia Regina, cynically exploiting elderly parents' cognitive vulnerability to obtain grotesquely disproportionate estate advantage, violating fundamental principles of succession equity and elderly protection against abusive family exploitation. The sentence continued, specifically analyzing each line of presented evidence. Contemporary medical records unequivocally document testator's progressive cognitive decline, culminating in formal diagnosis of initial vascular dementia, 8 months preceding death, and worryingly low score on standardized neurological tests, only 1 month before questionable testamentary drafting, establishing significant mental impairments incompatible with full testamentary capacity required for permanent estate decisions of involved magnitude. Expert handwriting analysis conducted by judicially recognized specialists objectively identified unequivocal characteristics of impairment during testamentary signature execution, including tremors, hesitations, pressure variations indicative of confusion or disorientation, dramatically contrasting with authentic signatures from preceding periods when testator enjoyed full cognitive health. Convergent testimonies from multiple independent sources corroborate cognitive decline directly observed through contemporary social interactions, revealing growing temporal confusion, compulsive repetitions of questions answered moments before, personal disorientation episodes incompatible with maintenance of complex judgment capacity necessary for conscious testamentary decisions. Additionally, testimonial evidence establishes worrying pattern of progressive control exercised by defendant over vulnerable testator during critical period preceding testamentary drafting, including constant supervision of his social interactions, active discouragement of communications with other family members, including plaintiff, and dominant presence during medical consultations, potentially influencing mental capacity characterizations presented to professionals. Final dispositive part of sentence decreed devastating legal and financial consequences for Patricia. I rule entirely favorably the will annulment action moved by Deborah Cristina Almeida against Patricia Regina Almeida. 2. Declare null for consent defect the public will drawn in name of deceased Mauricio Silva. Determine equitable estate redistribution according to applicable standard succession legislation, dividing total estate half and half between both legitimate heir daughters. Condemn defendant Patricia to return to plaintiff Debray amount of $380,000 corresponding to difference between amounts disproportionately received by her and amounts she should have legitimately received through equitable distribution, plus monetary correction since original date of fraudulent distribution and late interest of 1% per month. Condemn defendant to payment of attorney fees of 20% on condemnation value and totality of incurred procedural costs. $380,000. The number danced gloriously on page, representing not just substantial financial recovery, but mainly validation of violated dignity, judicial recognition of perpetrated injustice, accountability of manipulator who cynically exploited vulnerability of elderly father for disproportionate personal enrichment. It wasn't complete restitution of everything lost during years of suffering, financially paying fraudulently inherited debts, but it was tangible justice conquered through determined perseverance, refusing to resignedly accept role of permanent powerless victim. Patricia predictably appealed the sentence to second instance court. desperate appeal attempting to reverse decisions solidly grounded in multiple convergent evidence. But appeal was unanimously denied by a panel of 3 appellate judges who integrally maintained first instance sentence, recognizing robustness of legal grounding and adequacy of evidentiary analysis competently conducted by Judge Helena. With res judicata of decision-making it definitive and unappealable, forced execution phase began to recover due amount. Judicial blocking of Patricia's bank accounts transferring available funds, seizure of properties including luxurious mansion bought with fraudulently inherited money, arrest of corporate participations in her aesthetic clinics. Execution process extended 8 additional months due to her multiple dilatory attempts to hide assets or fraudulently transfer them to third parties, but eventually, I fully recovered $380,000 judicially deposited in my bank account, finally, concretely, tangibly, representing restorative justice. With substantially recovered resources transforming financial situation from precarious scarcity to modest comfortable stability, I methodically, deliberately rebuilt life. Bought small but own apartment finally in safe neighborhood, eliminating insecurity of monthly rents, consuming income, furnishing with carefully chosen pieces, prioritizing functionality and comfort over superficial ostentation, creating genuinely my space free of contaminated traumatic memories. Conservatively invested substantial portion of recovered resources in diversified financial applications, generating supplemental passive income, complementing self-employed accounting work I continued passionately exercising because it offered significant professional purpose and satisfaction of assisting honest small entrepreneurs navigating oppressive tax complexities. More important than financial recovery was gradual emotional recovery facilitated by continued therapy with psychologists specialized in family traumas, processing deep layers of pain, anger, betrayal experienced during years of uncontested injustice. I slowly, painfully learned to forgive not Patricia's actions, which remained morally unforgivable, but to forgive my own naivety, blindly trusting when I should have questioned more assertively. Forgive natural human weaknesses of wanting to believe better about loved people, even when evidence suggested appropriate caution. Forgiveness didn't mean impossible family reconciliation or betrayal, forgetting, but meant liberation from corrosive anger, consuming emotional energy that could be more productively invested building positive future, instead of indefinitely ruminating painful past. Relationship with Patricia remained irreparably destroyed as inevitably expected. We maintained no contact whatsoever after judicial process conclusion, except necessary formal communications mediated by attorneys, finalizing pending estate matters. Occasionally, I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had sold luxurious mansion fraudulently acquired to pay part of judicial condemnation, closed one of 3 aesthetic clinics due to financial difficulties resulting from judicial blockings and professional reputation damaged when tested. Fraud story circulated local community. Separated from husband Rodrigo, who apparently couldn't withstand financial pressures and public exposure of her fraudulent behavior. I didn't feel sadistic satisfaction imagining her difficulties, because true revenge didn't reside in causing proportional, reciprocal suffering, but in living well, authentically prospering, transforming destructive trauma into shareable wisdom, helping others navigating similar situations. I regularly volunteered at local non-governmental organization specialized in elderly rights and protection against family exploitation, publicly sharing personal story in educational workshops, alerting families about warning signs of financial manipulation of vulnerable elderly relatives, encouraging victims to seek justice instead of resignedly accepting perpetrated injustice simply because perpetrators are family members. Each person helped through provided guidance or facilitated connections with appropriate legal resources, partially represented redemption of experienced suffering, transforming individual pain into beneficial collective purpose, multiplying positive impact beyond limited personal recovery. 3 years after final transformative judicial sentence, I met Carlos Mendonca at a lecture about ethical succession planning that we both attended for different reasons. He, as recently specialized family law attorney seeking to deepen knowledge in complex succession issues, I, as testamentary fraud survivor, invited to share victim perspective illustrating devastating human consequences of fraudulent manipulations. We naturally conversed after a lecture about respective experiences. Immediate connection developing based on shared values of professional integrity, genuine compassion for vulnerable, commitment to justice transcending limited personal interests. Carlos was gentle, 44-year-old man, widower for 4 years after losing wife to aggressive cancer. Brown eyes transmitting empathy conquered through own loss. Viscerally understanding pain of family betrayal because he had witnessed siblings bitterly fighting over his parents' inheritance years ago, destroying previously close fraternal relationships. Relationship developed gradually. respectfully over months, through casual coffees becoming regular dinners, deep conversations honestly sharing vulnerabilities without protective masks, discovering fundamental compatibility in essential values. Life objectives. Healthy relationship visions based on constant, honest communication and unshakable mutual respect. Carlos never pressured premature intimacy. Patiently understood that rebuilding trust after devastating family betrayal required generous time, measured by natural rhythm of progressive healing instead of impatient stopwatches dictated by arbitrary social conventions about appropriate romantic relationship progression. 2 years after meeting him, we married discreetly in small, meaningful ceremony held in botanical garden during flowering spring with only 20 carefully selected guests, including Dr. Walter as honored guest representing fundamental instrument of restored justice enabling life reconstruction. That culminated in that celebratory moment. Exchanged vows, emphasized egalitarian partnership, complete financial transparency, honest communication about important decisions, joint growth through inevitable adversities life would present in future, commitment to never allowing estate issues to corrode underlying fundamental human relationship. Today, at 46 years old, with life radically, wonderfully different from existence. I imagined at 42 when I finally paid off last installment of fraudulently inherited debts, desperately contemplating 5 wasted years and unnecessary suffering. I paradoxically recognize that Patricia's devastating betrayal, though extremely painful, was necessary involuntary catalyst, forcing transformative growth that would remain indefinitely dormant within comfortable zone of resigned conformity with passively accepted injustice. I don't thank for betrayal nor completely forgive her specific actions, but I serenely recognize that overcome adversity substantially strengthened character, clarified authentic values, taught profound lessons about human resilience, importance of persistently fighting for justice even when probabilities seem discouragingly unfavorable, value of competent professional allies genuinely dedicated to just causes transcending purely financial motivations. Justice, when finally achieved after persistent prolonged struggle, possess special sweetness infinitely transcending satisfaction of easy victories obtained without significant effort or sacrifice. $380,000 recovered represented not just money but public judicial validation of suppressed truth. Official recognition of perpetrated manipulation. Accountability, a perpetrator, cynically exploiting vulnerability of beloved father. Monetary value was secondary compared with restoration of violated dignity. Confirmation that legal system, though imperfect and frequently slow, can eventually serve justice when competently. Navigated by dedicated professionals and supported by victims refusing to resignedly accept injustices simply because perpetrators initially possess superior resources. If you enjoyed this story of overcoming, vindication, and rebuilding, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your story of overcoming also deserves to be told. To hear the next story, click the box on the left. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are much stronger than any betrayal can make you seem.